I like that music when I talk. We need that all the time. Hey, it's really great to have you here at Chase Oaks. So glad you are, whether you're here at our Legacy campus where I'm physically on stage or you're at our 544 campus over in where I live, over in the Murphy, Wiley area, that area, or at our Sloan Creek campus up in the Fairview, East Allen area. Or if you're online right now and watching that way, the cool thing is we have people really all over the world, not just in this area, but all over the world who are participants who are Chase Oakers online. I found out this week a growing number in the Middle East where it's really difficult to be a Christ follower. And so I just want us to give some support and encouragement. Let's thank them for being Chase Oakers. And we love you guys, praying for you. So today we are in week 2 of this new series we started last week called Tribe, which is about forming the kind of relationships around us and maintaining those relationships where people are with us and for us in life in a way like the song we just sang that make us feel brand new, that are life-giving, energy-giving, perspective-giving, comfort-giving relationships. And today we're going to see one of the key factors in actually making that happen, because most people, even though these are so key to the life God wants, most people do not have the kind of tribe we're talking about. And a big reason is because of what we're talking about today, because there's a risky decision that we have to make. And the factor that we're talking about today is vulnerability and the choice to be known, to be authentic. Because then that kind of puts us at the mercy of others. And in a culture like ours, we just don't do that very much. It's pretty difficult to make the choice to be vulnerable. Now, I feel like God in his sense of humor gave me an illustration of that a few months ago, of vulnerability and how uncomfortable vulnerability can be. So here's how that happened. Actually, let me warn you that the story I'm about to tell is really not the kind of story you want to share in church. So don't tell the other services, don't tell the other campuses, don't tell our board of directors, our elders, because, they might not like it. And if you get wigged out by digestion problem stories, I just apologize in advance, okay? It's not that graphic or that bad, but here's the deal. So I was having some issues down south. It happens. And this was a few months ago, and it was in between services. And I was in the lobby here at the Legacy campus between the 9 o'clock and the 10:45 service, about 10 minutes before the 10:45 service, which meant there were hundreds and hundreds of people in that lobby coming and going. And I, needed to take care of some business. And so there was some urgency there, so I didn't want to go all the way to the green room. The bathroom's right there. I didn't want to go in the large bathroom because that's always weird meeting people, especially like for the first time, in the bathroom. They're like, hey, I've always wanted to meet you. I'm like, well, some other time, let's do that. It's just weird. And then I go in the family bathroom. So I have some urgency, there. So I go in the door, open the door, lock it, and then close it. Now, and then, start. Now, if you listen carefully, that's out of order. Okay, so I open the door, lock it to where the bolt goes out, and then close it, which meant it wasn't closed. It was held open by the bolt. I didn't realize that until I was seated and deeply committed to the project. So I was as vulnerable as I've ever been in my life. I mean, I had, there I was. And all these scenarios are going through my mind. I mean, like, it's a family bathroom. So I'm thinking, here's some parent with a little kid. Oh, look, there's our pastor. Just like, great, So, and I can hear hundreds of people right outside the door going around. I'm thinking, this is not good. My prayer life went way up. And I'm praying and just, God, please, in your mercy, whatever. And I know this isn't a Red Sea kind of miracle like Moses, but it's pretty close. Because nobody came in, which was amazing. And yet, what a bad feeling. And ever since then, I've been the most obsessive, compulsive person about locking the door and making sure and, all that. I'll even reopen it and do it again because I never want to be in that situation. Now, that was accidental vulnerability. But what we're talking about today is probably a crazy choice because we're talking about being vulnerable on purpose in our relationships in a way where we allow the real self to be seen, to be known, knowing there's a risk to that because we can get hurt and misunderstood and all, we're at the mercy of others. But it also comes with a big reward, and that reward is the kind of relationships we're talking about. You and I cannot have the relationships we're talking about without vulnerability and authenticity, the choice to be known. And it's not easy to do that. There's a lot of things, as we'll see today, in our own nature that fight against that because we want to protect ourselves. But we also, it's pretty rare because in our culture, certainly those of you who live in North Dallas, North Dallas is maybe as much as any other place in the universe, as any other place in history. A lot of good things, but we're a veneer culture, a facade culture. We've got such nice facades. We just look at our neighborhoods and our family portraits and our Facebook profiles, and everybody just looks so together and all. And inside, we know it's not together. But everybody else looks so together. I hope they don't realize I'm not together because they're all together. But everybody's thinking the same thing as we relate facade to facade, and we have to buck that. And today we're going to talk about, what is that? What is a picture of that? We're going to see a picture of that and then think, how do we do that and when? So if you are following along in the Bible with me, we're going to be in the New Testament in this pretty big book called 2 Corinthians. We were same place we were last week. We were in the book of 2 Corinthians where Paul very openly shares his struggles. And if you missed last week, let me encourage you to go online and watch it since it's the introductory week of the series. But I'll catch you up to the passages we looked at here in a little bit. But we looked at Paul sharing at a very difficult time his struggles in a very open, authentic, vulnerable way. And it's remarkable when you understand what was actually going on in the church and in the book at the time. It makes his choice to be that open and vulnerable almost seem crazy when you understand what's going on in the book. And so that's what we're going to do, is we're going to see, what was going on in the book of 2 Corinthians, which will also be helpful. If you've ever tried to read the book of 2 Corinthians on your own, like in Bible reading, it's a really weird book if you don't know the backstory, because it's like Paul is trying to prove himself or brag, but then he doesn't want to, and he's real uncomfortable, and you can tell he's really hurting, and you don't know why, and it just goes on and on. You think, what's going on? Well, we're going to see what's going on. Here's what was going on. So years before he wrote 2 Corinthians, he is a missionary, church planter, starts churches. He goes into Corinth, the city of Corinth, as a missionary. There are 0 Christ followers when he gets there. None, 0. Nobody's heard about Jesus and how God, Jesus is God who came to make it possible for us to know him and all that. They don't know. So he goes and begins to share that good news with people. And a number of people begin a relationship with God through faith in Jesus. And he gathers those believers, what he always did. He gathers those believers and forms a church like this one, a local church. And he spends 18 months, a year and a half there, teaching these believers and helping them understand what it means to follow Christ. And then as they get more underneath them spiritually, some of those have leadership gifts. He begins to build into those leaders so they could lead the church when he goes on to start another church in another place. And that's exactly what happens. So these people at that point, when he goes off to start other churches, they're tight. Paul is like their spiritual father. They're like his spiritual children. It's all good. And then he goes off, and a number of years go by, and then some trouble comes. And trouble comes in the form of these other so-called Christian teachers who come in, who are very legalistic in their mindset, who don't like Paul's version of Christianity, which is the only version of Christianity, but who, coming out of a very legalistic setting, oppose Paul's teaching in the New Testament teaching that the way we relate to God is about grace, God's grace, not our works. It's not about us trying to be good enough for God, but it's the fact that we can't, and God reaching out for us. And that it's not about our works, but it's about the work of Jesus on our behalf. And they oppose that. They're like, yeah, okay, God's grace is nice and everything, but really it's about our works, and here's the law, and here's what you got to do, and you got to do everything just right and all. And the problem with that is these people were very impressive. They were skilled communicators and orators. They knew a lot of the Old Testament. They sounded really impressive. And if they were around today, they would have their own radio programs and TV programs and books they write. Everybody would read them and think they're so great because they were really impressive people. And in comparison to Paul looked kind of plain. And so a number of the people in the church were swayed that direction. And there's this division in the church. And Paul writes 2 Corinthians to say, okay, I'm going to come visit you guys, and I'm going to set things straight. I'm going to deal with those people. But before I do, I just want to kind of get some stuff covered so that it'll be a happier visit when I'm there. And that's the book of 2 Corinthians. And what he alludes to often in the book is what these other people are saying about him to tear him down, as they're looking for every bit of ammunition they can get to tear him down and build themselves up. For example, 2 Corinthians 5:12, Paul says to the church, "We are not trying to commend ourselves to you again," meaning prove ourselves, "but are giving you an opportunity to take pride in us so that you can answer those who take pride in what is seen, the veneer, the facade, rather than what is in the heart, what's underneath." If we are out of our mind, as some say, these people who were tearing him down, if we're out of our mind, it is for God. If we're in our right mind, it is for you. And then he goes on. But one of the things they were saying about him is, hey, that Paul, I mean, he means well, but he's out of his mind. I mean, that guy's bonkers. He's gone nuts. I mean, he thinks that a relationship with God has nothing to do with our works. I mean, really, come on. That it's all about God and his work and his grace. You really think that's the way it works? I mean, again, the guy's a nice guy and everything, but he's a little nuts. He's bonkers. But it gets worse, what they said about him. Go to chapter 10, verse 10. "For some say," these same people, "his letters are weighty and forceful." You know, he wrote much of the New Testament, right? We have his letters. "But in person, he is unimpressive, and his speaking amounts to nothing." Now, that's cold-blooded. I mean, really, have you ever had criticism that cold-blooded? I mean, it's tough, right, when that happened. And this was like, I mean, imagine if somebody said that about me. You know, I'm a pastor, communicator, and somebody said, well, you know, Jeff's okay when he writes stuff, but have you ever seen him in person? Totally unimpressive. And his speaking, talk about a dud. That guy's a dud. Now, nobody say amen, please, okay? Because my ego's way too fragile for that. But, I mean, that would be tough, right? But that's what they're going. Now, there's a number of other ways that they tear him down. For the sake of time, we're going to stop there. But then there are ways that they also not only tear him down, but build themselves up. These false teachers who've come in who are so impressive. And they want everybody to be impressed. And they're padding their resume and talking about how great they are. And in fact, they've somehow convinced the church that they aren't only apostles. Paul was an apostle, but they're super apostles. And we'll see that. Now, an apostle is somebody who, I mean, it's a very unique, exclusive group of people in the New Testament setting. So these were the people that, like the 11 disciples, I mean, I say 11 because Judas flunked, but the 11 disciples and then Paul and just a couple of others, that was it. These were the people that God was using to be the authority in the church as God was revealing the New Testament, and he was revealing New Testament theology through these people. So this was a pretty tight group of people, a very important group of people, and Paul was one of those, and they weren't questioning that. But somehow they had convinced the church that they were apostles. They weren't. But not only that they were apostles, but they were super apostles. Like they weren't like a regular apostle, like they were super apostles. Now we'll see that. But it seems like there's always those kind of people that are really proud of themselves and sort of present themselves that way and are like the super people. Like, you know, this is back to school time. And if you're a mom, and, you know, you go to your school and there's all the volunteer moms and all this stuff. Isn't there always like one or two super moms? They're just like, they're so impressive and they're pretty impressed with themselves. And they make you feel so small around them. And, or the same thing is true in school. You know, there's students like that just make you, they're just so, you know, so impressed with themselves and you make you feel small. In church, it happens too. You know, there are Christians who just, I don't know, they're so Christian. You know, they just do everything just right and they say everything just right. And when you're in a group and they pray before you, they're just so incredible, like so beautiful. And then you got to pray after them and you're like, I don't want to. Just what he said, because I can't do it. And I'm going to sound stupid, you know. And it's okay to have, I'm not saying, you know, you have to be a dud or whatever, but what I'm talking about is something beyond, you know, where you make other people feel small. That's a problem. Right? Like people who are genuinely great people lift others up. These were not those people. They were super apostles. And Paul talks about it. Chapter 11, verse 5. I do not think I'm in the least inferior to those super apostles. I may indeed be untrained as a speaker, because in that setting, rhetoric was a big deal. This is before TV, and you have these orators who would come into town, and they were very impressive. They had a lot of training, and Paul didn't have that. He says, I may indeed be untrained as a speaker, like they are, but I do have knowledge. We have made this perfectly clear to you in every way. Was it a sin for me to lower myself in order to elevate you by preaching the gospel of God, the good news about Jesus, to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so as to serve you. What Paul's talking about here is he had a commitment that this was just his policy. It wasn't a biblical thing like he had to do this, but he just chose to do this, that when he started a church at a new place, that he would not receive a salary from that church while he was starting it. And the reason he did that was because he wanted to be above reproach or above the potential misunderstanding in that culture that, hey, this guy's just trying to get your money. Because as he came into a new, like Corinth, where they'd never heard about Christianity, right? And part of Christianity, part of being a Christ follower is how we honor God with our finances. And so Paul would have taught that. That would have been part of what he was talking about. How we tithe, we set aside the first percentage of our income and we give that to God and we give that to the church and all. And that's new ground. That's like crazy if you're not used to that. And then if Paul's like taking part of that, then it looks like to other people outside the faith that this guy's just doing that so he can get rich, so he can get their money. And so Paul's like, you know why the church is being established? I'm just not going to take, I could if I wanted to. You could even argue that I should, but I'm not going to because I want to be above that. It was a very noble decision. Now, he took money from other churches that had already been started to support his work there in those new areas. And when there was an interruption in that, when that wasn't enough, he had a thing on the side where he made tents, that people would kind of live in or stay in or you'd use in the markets, and he would repair them. So he had like his little business on the side. These guys were using that noble choice against him because they were professionals. They were paid by the church, and they were saying, look, Paul, he's not even a real pastor. I mean, he makes tents. He's got, he does that, and he does this little church thing on the side, but he's not even a real pastor. They were even using that against him. And then he goes on to talk further. By chapter 12, you can see he's just like exasperated having to do this. And part of why he's exasperated, this goes on for lots of chapters in the book, is that they're kind of playing the resume game. And assuming he's got a bad resume, but they're padding their resume, how great they are. And then Paul talks in these chapters. He's like, look, basically, he says, if you want to play the resume game, if they want to play that with me, I'd win. And he would. Paul actually was really well educated. He had the best theological and classical education you could have. If you wanted to play the resume game, he could do that. But he's like, I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to play that game. Instead, I'm going to play a different game. Verse 9, chapter 12. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, my struggles, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I've made a fool of myself, talking about trying to argue why he's really an okay guy. I made a fool of myself, but you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, for I'm not the least inferior to the super apostles, even though I am nothing. I persevered in demonstrating among you the marks of a true apostle, because that's what he was. They weren't, including signs, wonders, and miracles. They didn't do that. How are you inferior to the other churches, except that I was never a burden to you? Forgive me this wrong, meaning I'm sorry I didn't charge you a salary. I should have, I guess. I'm sorry I did everything for free if it causes this misunderstanding. Now, by now, you get enough of the picture of what's going on in the book. So you've got these people who've come in who are very impressive on the outside, and they're looking for every bit of ammunition they can get to tear Paul down and to make themselves look good. And in light of that, think about Paul's choice that he makes in the book that we looked at last week, to share his struggles as vulnerably as he did. If you were here last week, you heard Paul say in chapter 1, he let the church know. These super apostles would have read this too. They would have had all this information. He said, look, I got so depressed. We just gone through this time. You just need to know, church, I went through a time where I got so downcast, so depressed, that I despaired even of life. I was so down, so depressed, I didn't want to live anymore. And then in chapter 7, we saw last week how he said, hey, the only thing that rescued me out of that time, he said, when we had conflicts on the outside, my circumstances on the outside were horrible, and on the inside, I didn't have any peace. I wasn't strong. On the inside, all I had was fear and anxiety and weakness. But God intervened, and he gave strength. He comforted by the coming of Titus, this life-giving friend, part of my tribe that we're talking about in this series, these kind of life-giving people that are with us and for us in life. He said, man, God brought Titus, and that changed everything, not about my circumstances, but my ability to handle them, and I was able to have perspective, and man, that was so helpful. But think about that. Paul sharing that openly and vulnerably, those people would have totally used that against him. Like, look, man, Paul is such a loser. I mean, he gets depressed. He didn't want to live anymore. And then instead of God being enough for him, he's got to have somebody like Titus come and turn things around a little bit for him. But come on. But Paul's open anyway, and he takes the risk to be that vulnerable, to be known, because he knows that along with that comes a big reward. And that reward, for one, is personal integrity, but secondly, is deep relationships with other people who form a tribe. Because you can't have that if you're not willing to take the vulnerability risk to be known. You can get hurt, sure. But it comes with a reward, and that reward is rich and significant relationship that most people don't have. Now, that's one of the amazing things to me about Paul. I mean, Paul was, in history, arguably one of the most accomplished leaders in the history of humanity. I mean, you could argue, aside from Jesus, that Paul, in terms of one person who had influence on Western culture, you could say, well, other than Jesus, it's probably Paul. I mean, you could have a really strong argument for that because it was really Paul, from a human perspective, that God used to take the movement of Christianity from being just one church in a little area to a movement that ended up impacting the whole Western world. He was that good of a leader and that strong of an accomplisher. But to me, that's not that amazing because Paul had so many leadership gifts and he was so intelligent that he was bound to make some kind of splash, either for good or bad. What's amazing to me about Paul is that with all of that high-charged energy, that type A personality he had, you would think he'd be, not so relational, but that was the amazing thing is he was deeply relational. And you read through his letters, and he talks about as much about his relationships with other people on the journey with him as he does about anything else. And he does so very vulnerably and very openly. The joys when it's going well, and the sorrow when there's conflict, or the sorrow when people bail on him. But what you see is a person who is deeply, deeply connected to others. But in order to get there, he understood what we're talking about today and what he modeled, that the gateway to those kind of relationships is to make the risky choice to be vulnerable, to be known. And Paul, at some point, made that choice. And it's a choice that confronts every one of us as individuals, whether you're a Christ follower or not, if you want deep relationship, but certainly as Christ followers, to say, am I willing to make that choice? I mean, for me, one of those times in my life where I had to make that choice very clearly, I was relatively young, in my early 20s, and I was at seminary, which is graduate school for people who do church stuff. And in my first year of Dallas Seminary, and I don't even know how it happened, but I kind of liked it. I had the reputation early on in my seminary career of being kind of this young, up-and-coming hotshot. And I kind of like that, And people were saying lots of great things about me, and I kind of like that too. And I wanted to perpetuate that, And I was kind of starting to even believe my own press, so much so that when they were starting this new leadership initiative at the Leadership Center, that they asked me to be one of the leaders, and there was a little bit in me like, well, yeah, of course I would be chosen, right? And so I was chosen. The problem with this particular initiative, this leadership thing, is that it was really about character formation, about challenging things like humility and authenticity, vulnerability, all that. And I didn't know what was about to happen to me, but it was really good. So we get into this thing, and part of it, because it is about character formation, is there were counselors involved who were really good, and you had to go to counseling and all that. So after some time of this guy getting to know me, this particular counselor who's really good, he had this conversation with me, and he said, Jeff, you're kind of an impressive young guy. I'm impressed by you, but I'm not drawn to you. I mean, there's nothing in you that draws me to you. I mean, I'm impressed, not repulsed, but just kind of like, okay, whatever, but not drawn. And the truth is, if you continue to operate the way you operate, that's pretty much the way you'll be your whole ministry. I mean, you'll have some impact and all that, but you'll be a loner. You won't have deep impact in people's lives. You may attract a bunch of people. I don't even know what'll happen, but if you don't choose to be known, if you choose instead to be impressive rather than be known, then you're going to go down a pretty bleak road. And it was like, man, I couldn't really argue with him. And then he showed me this diagram, and we began to work on it. And I'll show it to you. So this diagram is basically, this represents the real self, the real you and me, okay? This is true of all of us. So this is like who we really are and who we're becoming also, that God is shaping and changing. And what he talked about is when you and I were created by God, we were created to operate out of ourself completely and to be, accepted and nurtured and loved and all that as ourself. We were made for perfection. But when sin came into the world, now the world is broken and we hurt each other. And all of a sudden it became dangerous to be an unprotected self. I mean, just think about going through junior high. How many of you want to go through junior high again? Okay, it's nobody. And I understand that, right? Junior high, if you're going to learn really quickly, I better not just be an unprotected self, right? And what we learn even before junior high in a fallen, broken world is we learn how to insulate our true self. And we kind of have these layers around us, these self-protective layers, these strategies that become our persona, that covers up who we really are. It's who we project to the world. And different ones of us have these layers will all be different. Like for some people in this room, the you present to the world is like Mr. Together, in control. You're a high accomplisher, or maybe you're misorganized and everything is just perfect. Or maybe for you it's humor. You're the funny girl or the funny guy. Or maybe you're the smart person. Or maybe you're super spiritual or super sweet or super encouraging, optimistic. Maybe you're apathetic. Maybe you're the tough person. I don't do emotions. I don't, that kind of person. Or maybe you're like Zoolander. You're ridiculously good looking, and you spend a lot of time making sure that you are as ridiculously good looking as you can be and who you present to the world. I mean, you get the idea, right? Maybe you're wealthy and that's your thing. Or, you're a leader and that's your thing. Or you're whatever it is, okay? We all do this. He had me spend time saying, okay, let's talk about your layers. What does that look like for you? And it didn't take very long. In fact, he did it too, and I did it, and his list was exactly the same as mine. And I thought I was really good at hiding this. But I wasn't. I mean, it's pretty obvious. Yeah, you go to this, this kind of who you are. But what he argued is, hey, this is the choice that you have. You're either going to operate out of yourself, the real you, or the stage you, the persona you, the act. You can either be impressive or you can be known. And again, I remember that choice in front of me. And what do you do when a counselor says something like to you that's really hard to hear? What should you do? Get a new counselor. No, I'm kidding. No, yeah, I mean, but it's so helpful. And I said, okay, I want to do this. Now, let me just share with you where I'm at on this. Because it's easy in that kind of setting to say, oh, yeah, that's what I want. But it's not easy to do this. So decades later, this is kind of where I'm at in some areas. So one area that's really difficult for me to do this in my personality is disappointment. To be open and honest and vulnerable when I'm disappointed. Like if I don't get picked for something or something doesn't work out the way I wanted it to or some publisher rejects me or whatever it is, it's hard for me just to say, that hurts. That's really disappointing. And to just live there and admit that. Instead, I may use self-deprecating humor. I'm a bozo, and everybody knows that. Or I'll be apathetic. And, who cares about them anyway? It doesn't even matter. I don't care about that kind of thing, even though I really do. It's hard for me as a parent, or was hard for me. I had to learn this as a parent to allow my kids to experience disappointment because I didn't want them to. And like, let's say they tried out for a hockey team and they didn't make it. It was easy for me to say, oh, that's a goober hockey team anyway. We'll get on a better one. You'll see, it'll be better. You know what? And just to not even let them ever experience, hey, it hurts when you're not picked. I mean, there is life after this and there's a future and that's all true, but it's okay to just be sad for a little bit. You know, that makes sense. When that's what's going on. Hard for me to do that. Another way it's hard, this may seem silly as an example, but it just happened the last few weeks ago when my son Colin got married, so it's fresh on my mind. But so Colin, my oldest son, gets married in Kansas City. They have a reception after the wedding, and it was a great party, and they had a great DJ, and there was great dancing and all of that there. And I don't want to shock anybody because I'm probably going to surprise some people, but I'm not a good dancer. And I bet a lot of you thought, I bet he's an awesome dancer, but I'm not. And for a couple reasons. One is I have no rhythm at all. I mean, I actually tried to take dance lessons with Christy years ago, and I flunked a community dance class. I'll share that in some future sermon, and you can't even flunk them, but I did. But the other part of that is I became a Christian too early in a legalistic church. So when I became a Christ follower, like at 12, 13, I just, we weren't so legalistic that we felt like it was unbiblical to dance. But we just thought, but if you really were serious about Jesus, you just won't. And so that's I didn't. So I never really learned to dance and all that, and never wanted it. So here I am at this wedding, and everybody, Christy, my wife, is out dancing to all this stuff. And I mean, I can do the slow thing where you just go like this. But I mean, she's, dancing. And my boys are dancing. And guess what I'm doing? I'm at the table looking really spiritual and trying to strike up conversations to distract the fact that people are saying, hey, how come he's not? And who knows? I mean, I have probably a lot to offer to the world of dancing, some of my moves. And, but the world's never going to know. And maybe one day I'll get over this and be willing to be vulnerable and to look stupid and to try it. And I'll probably be 90 years old and can hardly move, but I'll, be doing something. But right now, not. Or here's one more. That's tears and sadness. It's hard for me to do that. I just pretty much don't. When I get sad, I divert pretty quickly away from that. And because of that, I don't do the tear thing, really. So, in fact, it came up this week. So I'm having a conversation with my parents on the phone, and my dad has Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, and we're having a conversation, and it's hard for him to communicate now, and I understood part of what he's saying, so I'm glad he's still communicating and all that, but I couldn't understand something, and we just couldn't get there, and I couldn't hear him right over the phone and everything, and so. And I'm sure it was frustrating for him, but then I did hear very clearly him say, I love you, Jeff. And we're on the speakerphone, and my mom starts crying, and he does, and Christy's right around there, and it affected me, but it's not like I went all the way there. So we get off the phone, and Christy's like, do you ever cry? And this is my wife. I was like, I've never seen you cry. Like, I've seen your eyes get teared up. I've seen you choke a little bit, but like, I've never just seen you give yourself to just cry. Like, do you ever cry? Like, well, sure I do. When? Well, I mean, big time. When? I don't know. And that's not good. So I'm just saying that's right now. A lot of you are looking at me right now thinking, wow, I thought he was a little messed up, but holy moly, I got to find a new church. That guy is a mess. But I'm telling you, you're looking at me, but you do it too. All of us do this in our human nature. And so growth for us will look a little bit different based on that. But here's what I want us to do. If you and I are really going to be known, if we're really going to cultivate the kind of tribe we're talking about, we have to make the risky decision to say, I'm going to operate out of being known, not just out of trying to be impressive. And that's why when you came in, you got this little creepy fan. And this was my idea. I didn't realize it would turn out quite this creepy. But the point of this, and if it's too creepy, you can just do this, is, and if you're online and want us to send some of these to you, I think we'll have a lot extras, but let us know. But what I want you to do is put this somewhere where you get ready or whatever before you go out to start the day. And just this week, it's just a helpful question to say, who am I going to present today? Is it going to be the stage version of me, the act, or is it going to be me? Now, there's some people, we don't want to be me. I mean, some people are dangerous people, right? I mean, it's not all bad here. But we better have some people, right, that we just are acting that we're authentic with. Otherwise, we'll never be known. We'll never cultivate the kind of relationships we're talking about. Including a group, not just as individuals. And let me talk to groups a little bit. So a lot of you are in small groups of some kind. Maybe you're in a life group or some other kind of small group, a recovery group, something. And that's good. If you're not in a group, you need to be in a group. That's part of the discipline of tribe. But let's just talk about a group. What happens when a group forms? When you start a new group? What happens early on is kind of cool because you start a new group, you meet some people, and you realize, hey, we've got some things in common. You know, you like Alabama, I like Alabama, or maybe you hate Alabama, but at least we like football. Or you like chocolate, I like chocolate. Wow, isn't that amazing? You know, and we're just like meant to be together. And there's a sense in which it really is kind of cool. I mean, you realize there are parts of your story and their stories, you get to know each other that kind of start to mesh, and that's all good. It really is. It's all good. But it's what a lot of people, or what groups kind of people that study community and how groups form would call pseudo-community. It's community, but it's not really. It's pretty shallow, pretty safe. And if a group, that's a great way for a group to start, but if a group stays there, then it'll just either die a slow, painful death, just over a long period of time or a short period of time, but it'll never really go anywhere. Where you want a group to go is to authenticity, is to real community, where people are not just safe and not just shallow, not just nice, but just say, you know what, forget all that. This is what's going on. And I need you to know that, and I need your help. And it's always disruptive. It's what one guy calls the tunnel of chaos you have to go through. It's always chaotic and disruptive when somebody does that in a group for the first time. I don't know if you've ever been in a group where somebody did that, where they just shared something like goes out there and you're like, okay, it just got real. I don't know what's about to happen, but boy, didn't see that one coming, but it just got real. And how the group responds will dictate everything about the future of that group. If the group goes like, then that group's dead. It may take a while for it to die, but it's dead. But more than not, my experience has been people don't do that. Instead, people are like, you know what, me too. I mean, I may not have your same struggle, but hey, look, we're all in the same boat. Me too, I'm a struggler. And I'm so glad you shared. And can I share kind of what's really going on in me and in our marriage, or my dating relationship, or my singleness, or my parenting, or my soul, or my work life, or my sexuality, or whatever it is? Can I just say that what's really happening here? And then all of a sudden it can get real and go to a whole new place. And it takes somebody, though, to kind of break that ice. Now, I've shared this before, so if you've been around, you may know the answer to this. If you were in a group that is yet for that to happen, who should be the one, if you're in the group, to break that ice? Tell me. Not you. It's too dangerous. Talk somebody else into it. And it's always good to be the second person, because then you kind of know what's going to happen. Now, this is the kind of thing you don't get in every church, so no, it probably needs to be you, right? And it's not easy to do, but otherwise, we're just wasting time, right? We can get cookies and meatballs at Sam's. We don't have to go to a group, and so my prayer is that a lot of our groups, as we talk about this, say, hey, how can we move closer to here? Because the choice, ultimately, whether we're talking about groups, or you as an individual, or your family, or you as a parent, or you, whatever, is to say, how authentic am I willing to be? And there's risk attached to that decision. There's a risk when we allow ourselves to be known. But here's the deal. Most people really aren't out to get us. Most people really do want the same thing. They want to be known. They want to be connected. And most of the time, it actually works out better than we fear. Sometimes it won't, but most of the time it does. But it's worth the risk because the reward is the kind of tribe, the kind of relationships that we're talking about. So with that in mind, let's pray. Father, I again thank you for the practicality of the Bible, of your truth. And I'm thankful for the model of Jesus too, who was so vulnerable and so authentic. I mean, even when he, who's God in human flesh, was struggling, he pulls the closest people around him, his disciples, and say, look, I'm struggling, I need you. And Father, I pray that you'd help us be like that and to be able to develop the kinds of the relationships, to develop our tribe, to be parents who are authentic with our kids, not fake. To be friends who are authentic and not a stage version of ourselves. And to be groups that aren't just pseudo-community, but a real life-giving community. Help us get there. In Jesus' name, amen.